start anyway.
Well, good morning again. There was a moment at about 10 o'clock when I was gripped by what David Fitzpatrick would call communal panic as the heavens opened yet again, and it began to feel very damp up here. But to paraphrase two local heroes, you'd be well used to a drop of rain. So I needn't have worried. Anyway, the first of the panels this morning discussing Ireland's involvement in the First World War is about to kick off. Before it does, can I draw your attention again to the portraits along the back wall here and to the postcard reproductions of them in the book tent. They're produced by Harriet Selker, who's very kindly painted them for us over the last couple of months. The portraits themselves are for sale, as are the postcards, and I urge you to consider it. Anyway, let me hand you over to Carl Dinnon, who is at the far end of the table here and who's going to chair this first session. Carl is one of ITN's men in Westminster, men and women in Westminster. But prior to that, he did, for his sins, 5 years of Drumcree, was it? Before they brought him indoors. So there's almost nothing you can throw at him that will be new and less pleasant than he's experienced before. Over to you, Carl.
I should add, as a correspondent, not a participant at Drumcree. Great. Well, let me introduce the panel. There's a slight change to the advertised lineup because I'm afraid Dr. Heather Jones wasn't able to be with us. But starting at the end, Kevin Vickers is the Canadian ambassador to Ireland, has been the Sergeant-at-Arms at the Canadian House of Commons, where he became globally famous for his part in ending an attack there in 2014, for which he was decorated. Joye is the curator of Irish military history at the National Museum of Ireland. Dan Mullhall is second ambassador we've got on this panel, ambassador to London, but soon to be Ireland's ambassador to Washington. I'm sure frying pan and fire have been mentioned before this.
A number of times.
And Eunan O'Halpin has very kindly stepped in at the last moment. He's the Professor of Contemporary Irish History at Trinity College in Dublin. So, well, let's start on where Ireland was politically at the start of the First World War. I mean, Lar, if you could just start us off with a brief overview of what attitudes were in Ireland, I suppose particularly in Southern Ireland, where things might have been in flux, towards the British state that many of these people would end up going to fight for.
Well, that's a 2-hour lecture straight away. When we're looking at the period prior to the war, of course, it's a focus on a political level, which is on Home Rule and the implementation of the Home Rule Act in Ireland, which would have been a form of local government given to Ireland. And of course, that's a controversial thing at that time between North and South. And that leads really to the creation of two militias in Ireland prior to the war, which is the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, and the Irish Volunteers. So as a military historian, I always focus on the military aspects. So what you have prior to the war, though, is essentially two armed militias working their way in many ways towards a form of civil war. In this argument about what is the future for Ireland, will it remain tied to the European or to England, or will it have some sort of independence? And in a way, what happens then suddenly is that World War I breaks out and everything changes quite dramatically. But prior to that, things are fraught. As we saw yesterday in Ireland, and we heard from a lot of the lecturers yesterday, there are people who are invested in the future of Ireland, and then there are people, of course, who aren't engaged. They're not politically aware. Their lives go on as normal. But then you have groups who are very passionate on both sides. But you always remember, when you're looking back 100 years ago, we kind of think that everybody is invested in the future of Ireland, where Ireland is going. But for many people, they're just trying to live their lives, trying to survive. Economically, we have a great lockout in 1913. So that kind of shows up how desperate the lives of many of those people were. And extreme, I mean, just simply surviving. So it's very kind of on either side, you have kind of people with very strong opinions, mainly coming from middle class backgrounds who have the time, the energy and the money to think about things at a bigger scale. But for the average person in Ireland 100 years ago, the main focus is on survival.
So the war breaks out, and the age then, of course, was not the kind of information age we live in now, where everybody has loads of information. I mean, Eunan, how much did people actually have a grasp of what was going on the European continent? How much of an understanding did they have?
Well, I'll ask that question later. We have to remember on the 20th of March 1914, you had the single biggest crisis in civil military relations in Britain in 300 years. And by chance, well, not by chance, the only commemoration of it, I'll be talking about commemoration later, took place on the Curragh, one day late, organised by Trinity College, and that was the Curragh Mutiny. That was the point at which the army were suborned, the British Army, or elements of it, to say that if we are ordered to act against Ulster, we will not do so. And that was a trick because nobody had envisaged doing it. And that's a huge crisis, and it's very significant in British history that nobody remembered. Nobody at all. There was no, I scanned the Telegraph, which is sees the heartbeat of Tory England, no mention of the centenary whatsoever, right? The Times, nobody cared, nobody mentioned it, right? But in the history of the British state, that was the point at which the army said, we will not obey the government if we are chosen. And of course it got then transferred in British discourse, not into mutiny, but into crisis. But it was a mutiny, if you ask me. And Sir Richard Aikens, Lord Justice of Appeal, agreed, although two Irish lawyers didn't, precisely because they didn't have to. It was a successful mutiny in the sense they said, we won't do it if we have to. And the Asquith government backed down and said, we won't use force to enforce Home Rule on Ulster. And that's where, even more in some ways than the formation of the two volunteer movements, that's what we should remember, and that's what we don't. That's the first thing. When war breaks out, I think there's no question that in some ways, because of, as David Fitzpatrick has written over the years, in particular about militarism, because of the militarisation of Ireland, which wasn't unlike the militarisation of civic society across Europe and even outside Europe before the war, in some ways people were almost believed that combat and warfare was a legitimate thing. I think Catholic Ireland looked at, we're told about the rape of Belgium and Catholic Belgium and all that kind of stuff. I think there was an enthusiasm, if you like, in the early days for war, and it was the chance for nationalists to show, and for the Irish Parliamentary Party and their followers to show that we are loyal, contrary to what unionists would say, and we will fight. We will fight not only for justice, but we will fight to defend the empire. And that's what they did.
So this is a really important part of the Irish story and involvement in World War I, is the extent to which there were constitutional nationalists who wanted some level of separation from Britain, but who were still willing to fight for Britain in the war as part of
Britain, for the United Kingdom, of which they were part.
Yeah. Dan Mullhall, how much, what was the division within nationalism stroke republicanism? How many, to what extent was constitutional nationalism the majority view? And to what extent was the more hardline republicanism wanting an absolute split at the start of the war? How much sway did that hold?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I've always taken the view that the big divide in Ireland was really not about ultimate aims. I think most people of an Irish nationalist background would have wanted Ireland to have freedom of some kind. Now, they might have defined freedom in different ways. The difference was in terms of their assessment of the practicality of particular strategies. And let's face it, the revolutionary or the radical tradition in 19th century Ireland hadn't exactly covered itself in glory. I mean, people talk about an undying republican ethos, and I'm sure it was there, because it comes out in different times and so on. But 19th century, you had three miserable failures. You had Robert Emmet's Rising of 1803, you had the 1848 Rising, or the Young Ireland movement, and you had the Fenians, all of which failed miserably. So if you were an Irish person looking back at the historical record, you would say, well, this revolutionary tradition doesn't have much prospect of success. Whereas if you looked at the parliamentary tradition, well, maybe not wildly successful, but by 1914 it had come to the point where it had forced the British
Parliament, both houses of Parliament, to accept the principle of Home Rule, albeit that there was a division about what would happen to the counties of Ulster. So, for example, someone like Tom Kettle, Willie Redmond, they were quite radical nationalists in many ways. Willie Redmond was far more radical than his brother, John. Kettle once said a revolution in Ireland would be justifiable if it were practical. So I think a lot of it had to do with the assessment of practicality. And essentially what happened between 1912 and 1914 was that it was demonstrated for the first time in 100 and odd years that you could have a militia, an armed militia in Ireland with a nationalist agenda of 150,000 men, and the British government could do nothing about it.
And the people you mentioned Willie Redmond and Tom Kettle.
And then Ledwidge, whom I spoke about yesterday, they were all the same.
They still joined the British Army.
They did, because in the case, and I mean, I haven't studied this.
Sorry, it wasn't the British Army, it was the Army.
It was the Army. Well, but I mean, but they, in the case of the three that I've looked at carefully, Ledwidge, Redmond and Kettle, who may not be representative because they were all educated. Ledwidge wasn't, but certainly Redmond and Kettle were from that kind of upper middle class Irish Catholic background. Ledwidge was different, but Ledwidge also, through his association with writers and with the literary movement, had a degree of. So they weren't typical, if you like, of your average soldier. But in the case of those three, for example, all of them saw themselves as fighting for Ireland. Now, some might say they fooled themselves. They were, but that's the way they sincerely saw themselves, as fighting for Ireland. I mean, Kettle, for example, in 1915, published a collection of Irish war poetry, and he saw himself and those who were fighting the First World War as in the tradition of the wild geese who had fought. And now, he said, for once, we're out to fight for Ireland, not for France and Austria and the Catholic powers of Europe. So there was a genuine belief on the part of people like that. And the same was true with Redmond. And the same was true with Ledwidge. Ledwidge, as I quoted yesterday, talked about the need to defend our civilization against this alien ethos that was coming from Imperial Germany. And so in that sense, if you like, while they may have been nationalists in their desire to see Ireland free at some point, they also shared some common set of values which had grown up in Britain and Ireland over the preceding century as the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland at that time became more and more democratized and more dominated by people from middle-class backgrounds. So that was, I mean, for me, the big change in Ireland was the educational revolution of the second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century, where you had, for the first time, a significant body of people from Catholic nationalist backgrounds who were educated at the good schools, all the good Catholic schools in Ireland, with the exception of Clongowes and Belvedere that were founded in the early part of the 19th century. All of them come from the second half of the 19th century. So people like MacDonagh went to Rockwell, Kettle went to Clongowes, De Valera went to Blackrock College, and Rockwell. So, you know, and actually, one of the, for me, one of the fascinating things is that there was a generation in Ireland born around 1880, between 1880 and 1890, who were, to my mind, a very talented generation. And look at all the, you know, the great writers that emerged at that period as well. So there was something, and I think it was the educational revolution, the fact that for the first time, De Valera, Pearse, Kettle, MacDonagh, they were people that were the first generation of Irish Catholics, middle-class Catholics, who had a chance to go to third-level education, and they were the ones who changed the mentality of Ireland, in my view.
So broadening this out a bit to how this conflict starting in 1914 was viewed in the wider world. Kevin Vickers, I mean, how much did Canadians and Canadian Irish understand, know about, and want to get involved in the early days at least, this conflict which initially seems to be between European powers and involves Germany invading Belgium?
the population in Canada at the time, the outbreak of the war, the Irish were the second largest group of Canadians, just behind French Canadians. We were numbered approximately 500,000 Irish people were living in Canada at the outbreak of the war. Now, all the motivation for them to join the war has been articulated very well by all the panelists, because it's completely congruent. What the audience has heard this morning applies equally to the Irish in Canada. And I think first and foremost, one of the biggest reasons was this whole issue of home rule, wanting to demonstrate with Redmond that if they went out and fought well, that this would give credibility to the whole home rule self-government government issue. There's some other, at the time, just prior to the war, of course, we had this threat of the Fenian invasion, and principally the reason that our country becoming self-government was accelerated was the fear of the Fenians, who had this plan of coming up to Canada and capturing the colonies and holding them ransom for the freedom of Ireland, so there was this, even though that failed miserably very quickly, it left a stigma on Irish people that could they really be trusted? Are they true loyalists? So they wanted to demonstrate that, in fact, they were by enlisting. The Catholic Church in Canada played a huge role. The bishops in all the dioceses, the priests were hugely instrumental in the recruiting of Irish people into the First War. And lastly, economics. Unemployment was a problem at that time, and many Irish boys, this was salary. This was a way of happening, and I think I've cut myself short here because everything I've heard here this morning is congruent as well for the motivation. And 20,000 Irish-born Canadians fought. Many of them, there's legion of stories. This afternoon I'm going to talk about 2 Victoria Cross winners, young Irish boys, tremendous acts of courage. But no, obviously their contribution was significant. You can read with revulsion some of the incidents there's the group of a regiment from Newfoundland called the Newfoundland Regiment. Now the names of that regiment are nothing but West Cork names. All the names: Driscoll, McCarthy, Walsh, and I go on and on and on. That's all they were. But within 2 hours...
Are these, sorry, just on the names before you continue with the story, are these people who are first generation, or are they these people who emigrated themselves?
A combination, but and I don't have the exact figures for that, but there would be a combination of, as there were from the 20,000 that recruited, that enlisted. But within 2 hours of that, out of 800 men that got out of the trenches, 700 were killed. It was a slaughter. It was the province of which was a colony at the time, Newfoundland, lost a whole generation of men in a couple of hours in one battle.
Just before we go on to more of what happened on the battlefield, Lar, we've talked a lot about this, the motivation of Redmondites, Home Rule supporters for joining up. But Kevin touched on the economic motivation as well. Were some people just joining up for the money, or were they young men just joining up for the excitement? Was there more than that high political ideal going on?
Well, as historians, it's hard 100 years later to figure out why people were joining up. But the assumption would be a lot of it has to do with economics. In Ireland throughout the 19th century, the recruitment into the British Army is quite large. At its peak, about 45% of the British Army in the 1830s is Irish-born. Irishmen are overpopulating the army itself. They're also, through the Anglo-Irish families, overpopulating the general staff. And that's true for most of the 19th century. 16% of all Victoria Crosses were given to Irishmen, more than Scots, Australians, Canadians. Only the English beat the Irish. So that's a huge number of medals, well over 200 medals given to Irishmen. That kind of represents that figure from 1854 to 1944. So that tradition is always there. You then, as I said earlier on, you then have the people who are like Redmond and people like that, like Kettle, are very passionate in joining up for very strong beliefs. But economics plays a big role. There are 53 military barracks in Ireland. Every garrison town has a military barracks. There's a recruitment sergeant in every barracks. There's a long tradition. So for many men, it's an economic aspect and going down and joining up. One important thing to make the point when we talk about Irishmen in World War I is though, that they're all volunteers. They've made a conscious decision to join up. Conscription was introduced in the United Kingdom in 1916 in January, and it's not introduced to Ireland for obvious political reasons. So when we say roughly 200 to 250,000 Irishmen joined up, they all volunteered. It's a conscious decision. I would feel that most of them are joining up for economic reasons. But it's important, ourselves and the Australians are the only ones who volunteered for the war. Everyone else, eventually conscription takes over. And in January 1916, conscription is imposed on all unmarried men. So what you see between January and September 1916 is an increase in marriages, as men suddenly find that they're madly in love throughout England. So in September 1916, it's announced that all men, married or unmarried, will now be conscripted into the British Army. As I say, there are just two elements to remember.
Yeah.
It's worth noting that Canada had a conscription crisis, Australia had a conscription crisis, South Africa had a conscription crisis, precisely on this issue of whether you could choose to fight or whether you had to be made to fight. And it's not particular to Ireland.
And particularly in Australia, the role of the Irish in those referendums.
Yeah.
There's two referendums in Australia.
Archbishop Mannix was the leading opponent, and he was an Irishman, the leading opponent of conscription in Australia. They had two referendums, and both of them were defeated.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting. But the other thing, of course, is that when you think about it, when the conscription crisis finally came to Ireland in 1918, it galvanised the entire political spectrum. I mean, it was the conscription crisis of 1918 that finally did for the Irish Party, because at that stage they had to join with Sinn Féin and with everyone else opposing conscription, which suggests to me that attitudes in Ireland were quite different from what they were elsewhere, because in Ireland the war generated an ambivalence. There was, on the one hand, a belief in its capacity to bring Irishmen together. I mean, Kettle believed that, Ledwidge believed it, Redmond believed. Now, maybe that was the only way you could justify risking your life in that way on the Western Front and the terrible slaughter of that time, but they believed it, and they believed that they were fighting for Catholic Belgium and for the civilization that somehow, they shared. But at the same time, they didn't see themselves as committed to king and country in the way that perhaps people in England might have done.
So you have this mobilisation, but the Irish Union are, many of them, put into particular Irish divisions, now famous Irish divisions, and also the Ulster Division.
Ulster, yeah.
Is this because there are these ready-made volunteer forces that have already assembled, or are there other reasons? Why does that happen?
The UVF basically ceases to be a militia and becomes a unit of the British Army. It's a pretty clear transition. British Army recruitment traditionally by regiment is very regional, right? So naturally people were assigned to regiments which had an Irish and our regional identity. I don't think there's any confusion there. In other words, we weren't sent to the 7th. Staffordshire Yeomanry, by and large, if you're an Irishman in Ireland, you joined because you went to a local barracks to join. We have to get Irishmen also join the Royal Navy. Cork has a strong tradition, which long, even in independent Ireland, a strong Navy tradition because the Navy has always been here. And I think there's the economic factors are there, the political factors, but there's also just custom and habit and, in families, both middle-class families and kind of working class families, they're traditions of enlistment, and to some extent, dare I say it, even now, they persist, partly due to the defence forces, but also even now to do with British forces. Some young men, foolishly, want to be soldiers or sailors or airmen. I mean, I have a very Republican family. My great grandfather was a Sinn Féin TD in 1918. One of his great grandsons, who's now down in Tipperary, I won't even use he's a celebrated flyer. But he was a wing commander of the RAF, and he has the same link. But he like me, as a great uncle killed in the War of Independence, because the tradition his family was somebody always joined the RAF.
And Republicans joined as well, didn't they? What today we would term Republicans, the more hardline nationalists. So some of them joined. Tom Barry joined up, didn't he?
Absolutely. Yeah, he was. Why wouldn't he? He was a policeman's son, and from Kerry, not from Cork, of course. They don't like me saying that. and although, like, Kitchener was from Kerry as well. But yeah, Tom Barry. But why young men are fools? Young men go head. They see the drum, they hear the drum, and they see the flag. And in peace and in war, lots of young men join up. And don't forget, and I think it's overdone in terms of the First World War, the Western front end of it. If I see another poppy, I'll scream, right? Irishmen die across the world, right? Indians die across the world. Again, they weren't conscripted. It was a huge Indian army, enormously important in the wider thing. But young men are bred to war. They're bred to be soldiers. And they do it, and 4 out of 5 or so come back. They're not all shell-shocked, and just as veterans of the War of Independence and Civil War, whom I would have known quite a few, most of the ones I knew as elderly men and women were sane. They didn't shake. Dan Breen was an exception in that way, but most of them weren't visibly mad and weren't visibly terrified or traumatized. They went and back to normal lives, and we have to realize, however terrible war is, most people who engage in it come out the other end. As normal as we are.
I mean, also you have to remember that if there were up to 200,000 Irishmen who ended up fighting in that war, you cannot possibly attribute a single motive or even set of motives to those people. They are bound to be like any 200,000 people you might pick out of the population today. They would have a series of motives, and maybe none at all, and maybe just ended up volunteering. And of course, remember at the time, in 1914, the war was meant to be over by Christmas. So joining up was a bit of a lark in many ways. You were going to go off with your pals to France, and there'd be an easy victory, and that'd be the end of it. And you come home, and you'd have enjoyed a bit of soldiering. So I don't think we should ever try to channel people's motives into simple dichotomies or simple channels. No, I think people probably quite confuse motives, and I don't think it's possible at this stage to be clear about the precise motivations of those 200,000 people who fought during that war.
So many of them go into these Irish regiments and Irish divisions. Kevin Vickers, the Irish Canadian soldiers, do they go into Irish regiments, or they're discrete Canadian ones?
They're blended into Canadian Expeditionary Forces, which the inspector. I'm not an historian, nor am I an academic, but I kind of look at that and wonder what would be the reasons why they would not fight as an Irish regiment, a dedicated Irish, designated Irish, because there would be about 8 different Irish regiments in Canada at the outbreak of the war, but none fought as a, quote, Irish unit. But if I just make a comment, on the last 2 comments, Ireland paid, as all other countries did, one hell of a sacrifice. I've just received a book at a previous engagement down in Cork, where they have documented 5,000 Irish boys from the city of Cork alone. 5,000 from the city of Cork alone were killed during the First World War. And in Canada, though we don't have the stats on it, but on a per capita basis, out of the 20,000 Irish boys that would have went to fight for Canada during the war, 2,000 would have been. So, no, Ireland, it really paid in spades with their losses of life and contribution to the First World War. So
we have these regiments and these divisions, and they get to the front, and I mean, I suppose the Ulster Division is because of the nature of who they are, a bit more like some of the other English, Scottish, Welsh divisions. But Lara Joye, the Irish soldiers who go, because of their mixed motivations and because of the political situation in Ireland, are they treated differently by the officer class, who are, I think, mostly English?
Just call them out. There's 3 divisions. There's the 10th Division, the 16th Division, and the 36th Division. The 36th is probably the most famous. and it's a very strong tradition up north. The 16th and 10th were less well known until about 20 years ago, when more books came out and we learned more about them. The 10th is sent off very, very quickly to fight in Gallipoli, and has a terrible war in Gallipoli in southern Turkey, and disappears really because it goes off to fight Bulgarians on a front that no one knows about. Exactly. The 16th, to answer your question, is the unit that we would associate with the Irish Volunteers, with Redmonds, but they're never fully trusted. You don't see, as you see with the UVF, a transfer of the command structure of Redmond's men over to the British Army, while in the UVF you do see a kind of a crossover.
Are there Irish officers?
There are Irish officers, but you're seeing a mixing of what were the Irish regiments that have been around for the previous 100 years. There's 14 separate Irish regiments, so you have the Munster Fusiliers for Cork and Kerry, you have Connacht Rangers and so on. So there's a mixed match of officers, and then there's also English officers brought in to keep an eye on us, because we never can be fully trusted.
I think in the British Army, you have to remember that in 1914, for example, the key Treasury official dealing with the War Office was Sir Otto Niemeyer. And Otto Niemeyer was asked to change his name. Now, he was a tough man, and he told them where to go. Why? But the generals didn't like dealing with somebody with a German name. And the British Army, historically, was very suspicious of Catholics, okay? Particularly, obviously, because the British Constitution is based, in a sense, on anti-Catholicism. So as well as the Irish question of why the Irish, nationalist Irish, couldn't have a unit comparable to the Ulster Division, it was also underneath it the suspicion of popery. And that's, my late friend Keith Jeffrey, the great historian of the British Army and so on, the First World War, I would agree, this anti-Catholic thing is a theme, like it or not, in the British military at the time, and in the Royal Navy, God help us.
And how does that work out? Does that actually have an effect on the way that Irish soldiers and sailors are treated?
I think so. There's a suspicion of putting them together in kind of on a communal basis for fear that they'll raise the Pope's standard or whatever.
And there's historical precedent in 1867. The failed Fenian rebellion was a disaster for the Fenians, but the one thing that they were very successful was infiltrating Irish regiments and British regiments and turning soldiers to Fenianism. And that led to huge problems in 1867, 66 and 68, where there's soldiers sent off for 20 years to prison because they had become Fenians. And this kind of rises to what Eunan was talking about, this huge fear of kind of having armed Irishmen that could suddenly turn on us. And throughout the 19th century, there was a very strong split between infantry and cavalry units. There are not many Roman Catholics in cavalry units because they're an elite force. Infantry, yes, that's where the Irish are put into big time. But the cavalry units are different.
But the horses were Catholic.
The horses were all Catholic.
I mean, one thing I would be, I'm generally quite an admirer of the Irish parliamentary tradition, because I think they did their very best in very difficult circumstances throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. One thing I would be critical of is I do think Redmond could have made a bit more of an effort to offer his support for the war effort in return for certain concessions. I think that, to go out there and offer unconditional support without trying to barter for some kind of, because after that, it seemed to me, from reading the record, that Redmond was treated very badly, and he was ignored because he'd already committed himself.
But he refused to join the cabinet.
He was in cabinet, but even in 1914, it seems to me, he could have gone and said, okay, now, because the British were worried that Ireland might go into revolt. So he had a lot of capital that he could have used to say to them, okay, now, you're going to have to do the following things for me in order to persuade me to urge my people to go and fight on the battlefields of the Western Front. And I think he could have got a lot of concessions at that stage from the British government, because they were vulnerable and they were faced with an unprecedented situation. And instead, Redmond, I think, offered unconditional support, which I think was probably not wise. And then the following year, when the cabinet was rejuvenated, he, in order to fight the war more efficiently, he was offered a place in cabinet, and frankly, I think probably should have accepted it, because it would have at least given him some a position within the inner sanctum, because he was then on the outside trying to influence things from the outside, while his opponents in Ireland, the Unionist element, were within the cabinet and appearing to be pulling the strings.
You talked about Ireland going into revolt. Ireland does go into revolt, or at least a small number of people in 1916. How much do Irish soldiers on the front have any awareness of that, and what's their reaction to it?
Well, the French have much more trouble with their soldiery in the First World War than the army does with its Irish soldiers in the First World War. That's true after 1916 as before. One of the amazing elements of the Rising is that not a single soldier, as far as Irish soldier on any front or sailor, refuses to do his duty thereafter because of it. It's amazing. I found some years ago, and brought to the Imperial War Museum, a diary of a man called Dusting from Newport in County Mayo. And he records, he's a pre-war gunner who makes it up to be a warrant officer. Now, the Royal Navy is terribly snobby, but he's good at the technical things, so he actually becomes an officer and fights in the Second World War as well. But when he comes to the Rising, he writes down Sinn Féin rebellion in Dublin, and then he goes on. In November 19, he writes, poor Frank, his brother's an Irish soldier, poor Frank was killed. And to some extent that might seem very deadpan, but I think a lot of Irish men at war, whether they were moved by the Rising or not, the amazing thing is there was no reaction amongst Irish troops. I mean, we talk about the Cork Rangers, that's 1920, and it's a very complicated and drunken story, but there's nothing happens in Irish regiments whatsoever.
And Kevin Vickers, is that the same for the Canadians? I mean, do they have any idea about what's happened in Dublin in 1916? Do they care? Either way, for or against?
No, I think in Canada, the literature would tell you that for the most part, prior to and during, and again, one of the motivation factors would be to prove or demonstrate that that Ireland it was deserving of some type of self-government. And I think, as I mentioned, that one of the motivating factors for them to go was for that purpose, was with that in mind, that they could be, like the Canadians, like the Australians, Ireland could be an independent self-government nation.
So we have the war in full swing now. Just, Joye, could you give us an overview of how the Irish divisions get on during the war? Is their experience pretty much that of other British divisions, or is it different in any way?
No, it's similar in the sense that the 10th goes to war first, the 36th and 16th go to war in 1916. Their casualty rates are colossal. We were talking about yesterday casualty rates in the War of Independence. I think a figure of maybe police is 550 for the War of Independence. That's the kind of casualties in the first 2 or 3 minutes of the Battle of the Somme, because you're going up against machine guns. And one German machine gun with 5 men could normally kill about 750 men in a 10-minute period. You do have to realise that the military theory at the time was that the soldiers are marching towards the machine guns. Now, they're not completely mad. They've been told by their generals that the artillery, the big guns, have destroyed the machine guns. They hadn't. So you're seeing casualty rates of ridiculously high numbers in very, very short periods of time. So the 36th and the 16th Division lose 5,500 men during the Battle of the Somme. After the Rising, recruitment in Ireland starts to dry up. Opinions back home start to harden. The other thing is that people are starting to see the death lists at the back of the newspapers. There is censorship of reform, but people know what's happening at the front. They know the casualty rates are coming back. So recruitment is starting to die off. That's why conscription is introduced in England. So the war kind of grinds on through 1916, and it is really just the horrors that we've kind of come to associate with it. What's different about 1917 is probably the mud. The summer of 1917 is particularly wet, and that's when we start to see the kind of the horrors of the mud, in the sense that it's no longer going up to the front line. It's even just moving 20 or 30 feet in Belgium in the summer of 1917 can take an hour. And that's really what's the horror, if you like. And then the mass use of gas really reaches a mass industrial peak in 1917, and also the introduction of mustard gas. So in a way, it is the horrors that you've kind of grown up or you'd have seen in the newspapers. By 1917, it really has become a horrible war.
If I could just add to that, I mentioned earlier the Newfoundland Regiment, the lost 700 within, as I mentioned, within a couple of hours. And there's a quote here from a British commander of the 29th British Division. It was a magnificent display of trained and disciplined valor, and its assault only failed of success because dead men can advance no further. was the comment.
We touched on the idea of the Irishmen all fighting together and being brought together. Did that, once they got out to the battlefield down Mullhall, did that work out?
Well, as I said earlier, the sort of intellectuals, if you like, the ones that I've looked at, Kettle, Ledwidge and Redmond, and others as well, did think that there would be a coming together. Now, it was probably a naive hope at that stage, because I think it didn't change the fundamental divide in Ireland, which was between those who believed that a form of self-government, as much self-government as could be secured, was the best outcome for Ireland, and those who passionately believed that their interests could only be served by remaining within the United Kingdom and the British Empire. And it seems to me unlikely that the privations of war would have brought people together after the war and made Ulster Unionists and Irish Nationalists come together to reach agreement on a form of self-government that both could have accepted. And in fact, the Irish Convention is proof of that, really. Now, admittedly, it happened after the Easter Rising, so that may have soured things a bit. But what I spoke about yesterday was George Russell's attempts, and others like him, to come up with a compromise proposal for dominion status for Ireland within the British Empire, and with guarantees for Ulster Unionists. It just it wasn't acceptable to the Ulster Unionists, nor indeed to the British government. So if that kind of compromise wasn't possible, despite the fact that there were hundreds of thousands of Irishmen from all parts of the country fighting on the battlefields of Europe, I'm not sure that this idea, which was certainly one of the motivating factors for the intellectuals within the Irish contingent during the war, was really ever realistic. And okay, there are these instances, for example, of Willie Redmond wounded by shrapnel, being carried back by two Orange men from the 36th Division, but that was the kind of thing that I guess any soldier on the battlefield would carry back a fellow soldier. I don't think that was a sign of kind of orange and green coming together. But undoubtedly, to my mind, the great tragedy of Irish history is that the First World War broke out when it did. Because I do think that somehow in 1914 or 15, some kind of outcome would have been arrived at, and Home Rule would have been implemented in some form or other. Exactly how it would have happened is difficult to say. But the great tragedy was that by the time the war broke out, Home Rule, which had been first mooted, after all, in 1886 by Gladstone, still wasn't implemented. It was on the statute book, but it was deferred. And that just demonstrates how difficult it was to reconcile the interests of Northern Unionists with the nationalist community. And I'm not sure that any amount of shared suffering on the battlefields of the Western Front would have made any great difference in that context.
I'm going to open this up to the floor to questions in a moment. Just before I do, Eunan O'Halpin, did the experience of being in the army change the minds of any of those people who'd joined up and were lucky enough to come back? Had it hardened their view in either direction or changed their view in either direction?
My guess is for nationalists, those who came back, a significant proportion ended up in the IRA, and some end up in the anti-treaty IRA, right? Because for whatever reason, and something that they become quite important as ex-soldiers have been before the war, as trainers and so on, as well as thing. I mean, Tom Barry, look at his military service pension application if you want to look at a complicated narrative of his own. But Tom Barry, it's disputed as to when he actually joins the IRA, right? But he's very valuable because he obviously has amazing leadership skills, whether he got them in the army or not. But he has military training, and although ex-servicemen on the one hand are targeted disproportionately, as we heard yesterday, but ex-servicemen also are valued because a lot of them have particular skills.
What's their motivation? Is it because they've come back and they think, right, we've done our bit, where's our return on this?
I'm not sure. It might be that. In many cases, though, they were young when they went to war. They come back and they join what they see as a legitimate fight.
But if you want to figure out or imagine what the attitudes of those who came back from the war would have been, if you assume that they were a cross-section of the Irish population, which they clearly were, they came from all parts of Ireland, they came from all different backgrounds and so forth. Look at the outcome of the 1918 election. So, you know, Ireland clearly changed, attitudes clearly changed, and one would have to assume that many of those soldiers who came back, those of them who came back in time to vote, probably voted for Sinn Féin.
Oh, yeah.
You know, because they were part of a wider population who voted in very large numbers for Sinn Féin.
Although we have to remember, and I know there's a pact, but in Ulster, a lot of people still vote, and throughout Ireland, for the Parliamentary Party, but particularly in what becomes Northern Ireland.
Because they don't want to be left out of a home rule Ireland, and they know that an independent Ireland is not possible. Therefore, a home rule Ireland for them is the best option.
Absolutely, and we talk. Can I just mention, we talk rightly and focus on minorities in terms of the Irish Convention, for example, which focused very much on the needs of the Unionist minority. One of the problems with the Convention is that they didn't address the question in principle of how do you look after minorities, plural, in a new Ireland. They only focus on the Unionist issue, and obviously what becomes Northern Ireland, you know, the minority there can forget it.
Right, let's see if any of our audience have questions. Some of you will have noticed that there are no women on the panel, or I hope you've noticed that by now. So I will prioritise ladies. There is one.
I'm very uncomfortable being called a lady, but I'll forgive you for that. No, I have a question. I think probably for the whole panel, but I reckon Lar might be the person to direct it to. I want to ask you about the Irish Guards unit, because I think it's very interesting what you're saying that on the one hand, after that the Fenians were able to infiltrate the British Army and the Irish units of the British Army, but then later, as far as I understand it, the Guards units were formed after the Boer War in recognition for Irish gallantry, right? So it seems to me that they had a very kind of contradictory attitude towards Irish soldiers at the time.
Well, the Irish Guards was a response from Queen Victoria. She was impressed by the contribution of the Irish to the Boer War. About 20,000 Irishmen served in the Boer War for the British, and then about 1,000 served with the Boers themselves. So it was the Irish Guards were established kind of as a recognition of that large number by Queen Victoria. So I'm not sure the Guards units themselves were too happy with the establishment of an Irish Guards unit, the Grenadier Guards and so on. But that's why it's established. So it is a very kind of strange relationship throughout the 19th century with those regiments, and it's a complicated one.
I think there was another question over here.
That's fine. It's okay. I'm not going to wrestle it from you. A question probably initially for Eunan and Lara, but I wonder, a lot of the discussion has focused on, I suppose, the political dimension of the phenomenon that was the Irish and the Canadian in the First World War. Are you aware of any research being done or being looked into around the sociological implications of that, I suppose, the trauma that may have been brought back, possibly not expressed by such a large section of the population? But is there anyone looking at that either as an interdisciplinary initiative as to what the implications of that generation coming back may have been for example, the economics of a new state emerging in the 20s and 30s? Just out of curiosity.
That's a very interesting question, and Eve might know actually of particular research. I think in general, the motif, if you read narratives of the War of Independence, if you read accounts at the time, the ex-servicemen are constantly in there, and they're very often, as somebody said it yesterday, perhaps David, they're very often seen as the poorest of the poor. They're the most likely to be unemployed. Now, that's partly because a lot of them came from the classes that were always on the margins anyway, which is why they were kind of military families. But the man killed in Cork, David Walsh, who's killed as a spy. Supposedly he was responsible for Clonmult, which is an IRA disaster for which the IRA were responsible by inefficiency. But David Walsh, according to his brother, who writes very powerful letters in 1922 about it, saying, look, he was just out of hospital. He'd never been the same. He'd been gassed. He never knew what day of the week it was. He was a complete simpleton, if you like. they're brought down by war. And there's no doubt, a friend of mine from County Laois, a retired army officer, when he was growing up in the 40s, he said there were loads of people he called characters around, and they were all ex-First World War soldiers who'd never, for whatever trauma they'd been through, and very often physical as well, but they just had never adjusted back to life, and they were on the margins. And the short answer is I don't know to what extent that has been studied, but you're quite right.
If I can help with what I'm reading about post-traumatic stress syndrome, that it's only in the last couple of generations that men are even allowed to express this. But I can tell you, as a young boy, crawling up on the lap of my grandfather, Sam Kingston, who participated in Vimy and had shrapnel in his arm that I used to touch. He returned, he was sent for ammunition, he came back, and there was a barrage of artillery, and all his comrades were killed, and he was wounded. But I remember my grandfather, Sam Kingston, with tears in his eyes, relating that story. So, doubtlessly, yes, suck it up and continue on with life. But, unquestionably, vast majority of these people would have suffered some degree of post-traumatic stress syndrome.
Okay, there's a gentleman here in the front row.
Good morning. Richard O'Sullivan. Thank you to the panel. I've travelled 500 miles and it was worthwhile. Just wanted to emphasise one or 2 points. That in 1914, of course, there were regular Irish regiments, 2 battalions. So there were existing Irishmen serving in 1914 in both the infantry, guards and cavalry. And of course, there were thousands of Irish-born people living in England who volunteered in 1914-15. And the regiment that my father served in the Second World War, London Irish Rifles, for example, in 1914, territorial outfit, Saturday night men. Pat McGill, the stretcher bearer from County Donegal, the poet, was serving the London Irish Rifles. Arthur Cunningham, one of 3 brothers from Clonmel, was killed the first day of Highwood on September 16, and his 2 brothers were in other units of the British Army, of the Army in 1916. So there were thousands of Irishmen, technically volunteers as they were living in England, but of course their life was in England. And when you do look at the Commonwealth War Graves site, you don't actually see the Irish addresses very often. They're London addresses, for example. So the emphasis, not only you're speaking about the volunteers of 1914 in the 3 Irish divisions, there were tens of thousands already existing, and those who served in England or joined up in England, Scotland and Wales. That was just a re-emphasis. My question actually is, in terms of the middle class, as you might have described them, nationalists in 1914, Redmond and Kettlewrights, in September 14, when John Redmond made the speech, clearly had influences by his statement. And what proportion of those volunteers that went with that were the middle class, with a middle class outlook? Were a lot of the volunteers in 1914 what you might describe working class, or were mostly of that background who would have followed the lead of John Redmond?
You would have had, in 1914 and 1915, as Dan was saying earlier on, there is this rush. Everyone does think the war is going to finish very quickly. So there was a rush from, especially middle-class Dublin, to join up. And they form into units called PAL units. So rugby clubs, football clubs, athletic clubs, and they do join up. And there is that kind of rush for the first 9 months of the war. Mainly going to the Royal Dublin Fusiliers and serving with them, and then suffering very large casualties in Gallipoli. You have on the knock-on impact then of the Great Lockout, you do see it's a very large employment rate in Dublin, and for them joining up is kind of a way of getting a wage into their families, and there's kind of increase among those units. So you have seen units like the 6th Battalion Royal Dublin Fusiliers, heavily working class, and then the 7th Battalion would be heavy middle class for Dublin. But within within the year, September 1915, their casualty rates for both those battalions are about 70%. Dead will be about 10 to 15%, and then the heat in particular and disease in Gallipoli led to very, very higher casualty rates than on the Western Front.
There's a question from a man over there in an excellent hat.
Ton. There was an excellent article in The Guardian yesterday. I read it last night after coming back from yesterday's session by Stephen McGann about a book that he's written about his own family history. He's an English actor from Liverpool. I found it quite fascinating. He's talking about his own Irish heritage that he investigated in terms of where they came from. They came from Roscommon, left after the famine to Liverpool. And he talked, the article was called My Lot Walked, My Lot Walked, My Lot Starved was the name of the article. But he said that his grandfather enlisted in or was conscripted into the English army in the First World War, that he deserted twice, escaped again, and then re-enlisted in the Australian army and finished out the Second World War with them. It's just another example of Irishmen serving in the First World War in different regiments that wouldn't have been necessarily Irish. Have we any idea as to, in terms of the Australian troops that fought in the First World War, how many of them would have been Irish?
There has been recent research on the Australians, and it's 6,500 Irish born in the Australian Army. And then if you're, again, because there's so many Irish transported over there, if you're to second and third generation Irish Australians, you could be looking at a figure of 20, 25,000. So it's kind of similar to the Canadian experience. It's very hard to kind of come 100 years later and define what is an Irishman. As Eunan said earlier on, they're all part of the British Empire, and in many sense, to talk to somebody 100 years ago and ask them what is their definition of Irishness, it would be different from what we have today.
Can I just say, we were in Suda Bay recently in Crete, near Hania, where there's a beautiful, perhaps the most beautiful of all Commonwealth war graves, and they're mainly Australian and New Zealanders. But, a quarter of them are called Murphy or Riley or whatever, right? Now, it seems to me they were probably fighting, in effect, for... We have to be careful in attributing that people who leave Ireland won't necessarily... They retain their Irish identity. It doesn't mean that they are somehow proxies for Ireland. The current Secretary of State for Defence, Sir Michael Fallon, who's an MP for Thanet or somewhere ghastly like that. Michael Fallon's father was teaching medicine in Trinity in 1939, as were his two uncles.
And his mother as well.
Yeah, and they all went off. Peter Fallon, the poet, was his first cousin, although they've never met. But the point is he became British. Ruth Kelly, who was Secretary of State for Education until she quit in 2010, her grandfather was an IRA battalion commander in Fermanagh in 1921. So we can't say when people emigrate, we can't necessarily claim credit for what they do. The retired American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the last one, Martin Dempsey, used to spend his summers in the Gaeltacht. The last American ambassador to the UN under Clinton, Samantha Power, was born in Dublin, daughter of an army officer. But they're American, so we have to be careful when we look at the Irish diaspora and claim try to cash them in as terms of what Ireland did or didn't do. People emigrate, and a lot of them emigrate, and they belong to the States. John Brennan, the retired head of the CIA, his father's from Roscommon. Not from Cork, I'm sorry. But do you see what I mean? When people emigrate, yes, we can be interested with our Irish links, but we can't turn that into an instrumental that they owe Ireland anything, or that they are necessarily batting for Ireland now, or indirectly fighting for Ireland or spying for Ireland now.
Although the curious thing is that Irish identity does seem to travel and become a more permanent feature of people's identity around the world. I mean, my wife's an Australian with an Irish background and also Scottish background, and I've of course been there. But then you think about America, where people can be 4 or 5 generations removed from Ireland and consider themselves to be Irish Americans, and even sometimes they'll tell you, "I'm Irish."
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean they're any less American. So, I agree with you. The identity of people around the world of Irish descent is complex, and in Britain, for example, the identity doesn't really travel down the generations beyond the second generation, and there are reasons for that, which have to do probably with the troubles of the 70s, 80s, 90s, which maybe dissuaded people from identifying with Ireland. But in America, people can be quite strongly Irish. And if you look at Australia as well, the fact that it was the Irish element in the Labour Party in Australia that successfully resisted the imposition of conscription suggests that Irish element in Australia was actually quite effective and, in some cases at least, didn't go along with the kind of imperial narrative that many Australians wanted to promote.
And it was, of course, it was an Irish Australian politician who notoriously put his hand too far down the Queen's back. Paul Keating.
Well, on the subject there of how these things are memorialised and commemorated, that will be the subject of our next session. So we'll wrap it up here so that people have time to take a very quick coffee break. But first of all, I'd like to thank Kevin Vickers, Lar Joye, Dan Mullhall, and Eunan O'Halpin. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I think it's really interesting that